All right, we're in Mark 11. So did everybody get a handout in the back? It's right at the center door, and it's the same handout that we had last time we had our class. So we actually worked our way through it just a little bit, but I thought since it's been probably a month and a half, we might as well just start back at the beginning of the handout just to kind of refresh our minds because we ended in the middle of a section. So we're looking at Mark 11, beginning with verse 11. And of course, this is just right after Jesus' triumphal entry. And that section of Mark, beginning in chapter 11, verse 1, it's a major section. It's comprised of, chapters 11 through 16 that ends the book. But even though it's a major section, it deals with such a short period of time in Jesus' life in comparison to the rest of the book. I mean, you've got chapters 1 through 10 that really focus on the 3 years of Jesus' ministry. And then you've got chapters 11 to 16 that focus on this last week of Jesus' life before his crucifixion. And then, chapter 16 specifically, the real focus is on the day of his resurrection, that Sunday of his resurrection. So these are very important events. And in chapter 11, verse 1 through 10, with Jesus' triumphal entry, that really is the event that seals Jesus' fate. The reaction that Jesus gets as he enters into Jerusalem, the fact that he openly now accepts being acclaimed as Messiah. Before that point in time, he hasn't let people publicly proclaim him as Messiah. But now, entering into Jerusalem on the donkey, with people putting down the palm branches and spreading their cloaks in the way and proclaiming him to be the Son of David and that the kingdom of David, is now coming. That is what causes the religious leaders in Jerusalem to really be concerned. And this is what seals Jesus' fate. So, Mark 11, verse 11 says, Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Now, that is the beginning of this section that is going to talk about Jesus cleansing the temple. Now, if you look at John's account, you see that John places Jesus cleansing the temple in the beginning of his gospel, in John chapter 2. And so some people have the view that Jesus only cleansed the temple once, and John puts the event in a different place in his gospel account, for whatever purposes he had in his arrangement of material. But I prefer to understand it differently. I think that Jesus probably cleansed the temple twice, once at the beginning of his ministry, which is recorded in John, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke are silent about, and then once at the end of his ministry, which is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John is silent about it. But this is going to be a very, very significant event, again, as it relates to Jesus' crucifixion, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So as Jesus goes into the temple and he looks around, this is the evening. Of course, the Jewish day ends at 6 o'clock. At 6 p.m. you move from one day to the next day because they count the day an evening and a morning, you see. So it's evening whenever he enters into Jerusalem. He goes into the temple and he looks around and he sees all the corruption, but because it's so late in the day, he doesn't do anything about it until the next day. All right, so the story of Jesus' crucifixion is sandwiched in between this story of Jesus cursing the fig tree. So he'll curse the fig tree one morning, and the next morning the disciples will make an observation that the fig tree is cursed, and sandwiched in between that is Jesus cleansing the temple. So we're going to notice, as we noted the last time we had class, there is a symbolic significance to Jesus cleansing the fig tree. And so we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But at any rate, here in Mark 11, verse 11, we see that Jesus, he enters Jerusalem coming from the east. So you remember, he's come from Jericho. He crossed the Jordan River, came from Jericho, and then travels from Jericho to Jerusalem. But in traveling from the east, he's gone over the Mount of Olives, and on the Mount of Olives, you've got these little villages, Bethphage and Bethany. So Jesus, this is the Jewish Passover festival. And so it's one of the 3 pilgrim festivals that the Jews have on their calendar. And you read about these in passages like Deuteronomy 16, verses 16 and 17. So faithful Jewish men are required during these 3 festivals, these 3 pilgrim festivals. That is Passover, and then the Feast of Weeks. We know it probably better from the New Testament as the Feast of Pentecost, and then the Feast of Booths. All Jewish men were required to come to Jerusalem to celebrate these festivals. Now women, it was good for women to come. They weren't required to come because it was more likely that a woman could be ritually unclean for one reason or the other, or be nursing a child and not be able to travel. So there was some leeway as to whether or not a woman would come to these pilgrim festivals, but to be a faithful Jewish man, you had to come to the pilgrim festival. So, as you would imagine, Jerusalem is just filled up with these travelers who have come from all over to the pilgrim festival. And so not everybody's able to stay in Jerusalem. So Jesus will go into Jerusalem every day, in the week leading up to Passover and so forth. He'll go in there every day. He'll teach in Jerusalem every day, but that's not where he spends the night. So we see in the text here, he goes out at night and he stays in Bethany. And Bethany is one of those little villages, a little less than 2 miles away from Jerusalem. And so we don't know exactly, whose house he stays at every night. It seems like it's probable that he stayed in the home of Simon. He's called Simon the leper. In some passages, probably wasn't a leper when Jesus stayed with him. Jesus had probably healed him from leprosy. But very likely stayed in the home of Simon the leper some. You see that Mark 14, verse 3. Very possibly stayed in the home of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. You read that they had a home there in Bethany in Luke chapter 10, verse 38. All right, moving on. Verse 12 of Mark 11. The next day as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. So, it's morning. They're headed back to Jerusalem. Jesus doesn't eat breakfast before he leaves the house. Does anybody here not eat breakfast before you leave the house in the morning? Not me. I have my all bran every morning. Oh, it's wonderful. It really is. Can be a moving experience, actually, but sorry. All right, so he's headed back to Jerusalem. He hasn't eaten, and along the way he gets hungry. Of course, we know that Jesus is God. He's fully God, but he's not only God. Jesus is man. He's fully man, but he's not only man. He's the God-man. So he's God and he's man in one person. But while he's upon the earth, the way that he primarily manifests himself is as man. And Jesus has, all of the needs that we have. Jesus got hungry just like we get hungry. Jesus got thirsty even like we get thirsty. Jesus ate food even after his resurrection. That was one of the ways, and I've got the reference here under B, under verse 12. But Jesus ate even after his resurrection. It was one of the ways that he proved to his disciples that he was actually bodily resurrected, that they weren't just seeing an apparition, that they weren't just hallucinating. He's actually eating. But as we said here, and I've got this under C, the cursing of the fig tree that we're about to read about, this is not a standalone event. Mark has included this, framing his description of Jesus cleansing the temple, because this illustrates a point. This illustrates the point that made the cleansing of the temple necessary. All right, so verse 13. So seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Now, last time we had this class, we talked a little bit about fig trees. You know, they're plentiful in Palestine. The prophets use fig trees to describe the peace and the prosperity and the blessings that would be true of the Messianic age. I've got a verse there. When you look at the harvest of fig trees and you know, exactly what they did when they did what, that is, you see that fig trees would shed all their leaves in winter. And then in the spring, they would sprout new leaves. And I've got a verse here from Mark 13:28. The sprouting of new leaves on a fig tree signaled the coming of summer. And whenever they would sprout new leaves, oftentimes they would produce early figs. And you've got a reference to early figs there in Song of Solomon 11-13. So this is April of the year. So, you know, it's in leaf, summer's coming, and if a tree's in leaf, you would expect to find some early figs on it. Now, as the text says here in Mark 11, verse 13, it's not the season for figs. And you see the main harvest for figs, that's summer. The fig is a summer fruit, along with grapes. Generally, the full fig harvest would be in June. Grapes would be a little bit later in August in Palestine. But you see a reference to that in Micah 7, verse 1. So this is not the time when you would have the full fig harvest, but if a fig tree is in leaf, you would expect for there to be some of these early figs. So Jesus sees this, fig tree in leaf, and he goes over to see if it has any fruit, but it doesn't have any fruit. You see the leaves, and with the leaves you would expect it to have some of this early fruit, but it doesn't. All it has are the leaves, no early fruit. So there's a sense in which this tree is a little bit hypocritical. It's got all the leaves that might signal it should have some early fruit, but it doesn't. All it's got is the leaves. Now that's going to be an important point. And I think it's interesting to notice what the text says here in verse 13, that Jesus went over to find out if it had any fruit. You see, Jesus is God, and one of the attributes of divinity is the fact that, God knows all things, but there was a sense in which Jesus Christ limited his omniscience while he was upon the earth. Luke 2:52 says Jesus, grew in wisdom and in stature. As Jesus grew from a baby into a man, it wasn't just his physical body that grew, but his mind grew as well. Well, if you possess omniscience, you can't grow in knowledge because you know everything. And so there's a sense in which Jesus didn't lose his divinity, but he did not allow his human mind to access all the contents of his divinity. And that's a part of him emptying himself, as is described in the book of Philippians. Not that he lost his divinity, but in some way, don't ask me to explain it. I can't explain it. I can't explain how a brown cow can eat green grass from which it produces white milk and you get yellow butter from it. There's lots of things I can't explain. I can't explain exactly how that works, but somehow it was the case that Jesus did not allow his human mind to access the contents of his divinity. Though he did still, and I've got a reference here, display some superhuman knowledge while he was upon the earth. For instance, he knew what his Jewish enemies were thinking. And of course, there are no true mind readers among humans. 1 Corinthians 2:11 tells us that. All right, look at verse 14. Then he said to the tree, so it's in leaf, no early figs. Jesus says to the tree, "May no one eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say that. That's a significant point. His disciples heard him say that. Now, Jesus' words amount to a curse. When he says, let no one eat fruit from you again, that's a curse. And we know that because verse 21 of this passage is going to call it a curse. So, the question is then, why would Jesus have cursed the fig tree if it wasn't yet the season for fruit? And of course we've already given a possible reason, because if it's in leaf to this extent, you would expect for there to be early figs. So there's a sense in which this tree is hypocritical, so keep that in mind. All right, moving on to verses 15 and 16. Any comments on what we've said so far? And by the okay. Right. I think I mentioned about trees in our backyard. We've got a pear tree and we've got an apple tree. And man, the pear tree the last 2 years has just produced an enormous amount of pears. The apple tree has struggled, but I will say, the few apples that tree has produced, they are so good. But man, our dog Lola, she has torn those trees to pieces. I mean, that little dog can jump. And, she's jumped up and she's ripped limbs down, our backyard was just full of limbs. But anyway, even she couldn't destroy a tree in a day. So, to your point. Yes, sir.
Is that why we never see baskets of pears and apples in the kitchen?
Oh, yeah, that's why. Well, our pears, I will say, our pear tree, they're just not good pears so far. I mean, do you think they're good, Mary Kate? They're for a long while. You wouldn't want the pears, and the apple tree just doesn't produce enough. Did I see another hand? Yes, sir.
Our experience with a cottonwood tree.
Right.
That's about 30 feet tall. It's got all surface roots. Poking up the patio of the concrete.
Okay.
If you cut all those surface roots, it'll die
Okay.
overnight.
All right. By accident or intent? Okay. Right. Very good. All right. Yes, ma'am. You do what you got to do. All right, let's read verses 15 and 16. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those that were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. All right, so, when Moses brought Israel out of Egypt at Mount Sinai, he didn't just get the Ten Commandments, he also got a pattern for a tabernacle. And so, you remember there at Mount Sinai, the skilled workers, built this tabernacle out of all the riches that they had gotten from the Egyptians when they left. And, this tabernacle or this tent was temporary. It would just move from place to place. Well, in the days of, David desired to build a temple. David didn't think that it was right for him to have built a palace to live in, and God, his ark, to be living in a tent. And so he sought to build the temple, but he was forbidden from building a temple because, he had been a man of war and had shed so much blood, and God said, no, David, you can't build me a house, but your son Solomon, he's going to be a man of peace, and he'll build a house. And so David made preparations of, tons and tons of gold and silver and bronze and that sort of thing to build a temple. And of course, Solomon, began building a temple in the 4th year of his reign, and he completed the building of the temple in the 11th year of his reign. It took 7 years, which, that's significant. 7 is the number of perfection in the Bible, and so the temple's built in 7 years. And, it was one of the wonders of the ancient world. And so Solomon's temple stood until 586 BC, when, of course, God, judging Judah for its sin, brought Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian armies in, and they totally destroyed the temple. They burned it to the ground. And so that's how things stood while the Jews were in Babylonian captivity. But of course, in 539 BC, Cyrus, after he and the Persians defeated Babylon, he issued the decree. And for the first time in human history, people who had been in exile were allowed to go back home. And so the Jews go back home, first under Zerubbabel. And so, with Zerubbabel, they began rebuilding the temple. But then when they get some opposition, it stands still until the prophets Haggai and Zechariah stand up and began to encourage the rebuilding of the temple. So that's restarted in 521 BC, and the temple under Zerubbabel is completed in 516 BC. But it's not as magnificent as Solomon's temple was. And so that temple stands from 516 BC. Finally, when Herod the Great becomes king of the Jews, and of course he wasn't a Jew, he was an Edomite. But Rome grants him the position of king. And Herod, he wants to curry favor with the Jews. I mean, Herod was a pretty miserable human being. He tried to see how many of his sons he could kill. I mean, not actually that was a game he played, but he did murder multiple of his sons. I mean, he was just a miserable human being. But he began to expand and to make more elaborate Zerubbabel's temple, beginning in 19 BC. Because you remember when the foundation for Zerubbabel's temple was laid, do you remember what happened? Some people rejoiced, but the older Jews who had seen Solomon's temple and had lived long enough to return, they were children when Solomon's temple was destroyed, but they lived throughout the captivity and they were able to return whenever they saw the foundation of Zerubbabel's temple laid. Remember, they wept because it wasn't as glorious. You read about that at the end of Ezra chapter 3. Well, Herod wants to make the temple glorious. And boy, he does. He makes it huge. And so I've got some of the details here concerning Herod's temple, which again is an enlargement of Zerubbabel's. But the temple complex was massive. It consumed more than 1/4 of Jerusalem. And the temple courts the temple courts themselves could accommodate more than 75,000 people at once. So you start on the inside and you've got, the temple proper, okay? And then you move out from that and you've got the court of priests that, of course, only the priests could be in. And then you've got the court of Israel that only Jewish men could be in. You go beyond that, you've got the court of women that Jewish women could be in. And then beyond that, you had the court of the Gentiles. Now, surrounding the innermost court, between the court of the Gentiles and the court of women and the rest of the temple, you had this 5 or 6 foot tall balustrade, and on it, multiple places, and archaeologists have found this, multiple places, you had this inscription that said, "Let no man of another nation enter inside the barrier and the fence around the temple, and whoever is caught will have himself to blame, that his death ensues." Now you remember one of the excuses that the Jews used to try to kill Paul. Remember when Paul was in the temple, purified, to signify the time when the 4 Jewish Christians' vow would be complete and sacrifices could be offered for that vow. One of the excuses the Jews used to beat Paul and try to kill Paul was they claimed that he'd brought Trophimus the Ephesian into the temple. And so this would have given them that excuse. But at any rate, at this point, what I want us to see is that this court of the Gentiles, where only the Gentiles could go, and they couldn't go beyond that. Only Jews could go beyond that. It was a 26-acre court. So, it's a big court, but anyway, that's where the only place that Gentiles were allowed to go in the temple. All right, so we've described the temple, all right, in the temple court. So Jesus cleansing the temple, that takes place in the court of the Gentiles. So keep that in mind. Okay. Now, when Jesus goes into this court of the Gentiles, right, he sees people who are buying and selling there. And Jesus, in Jesus' case, you don't say Jesus loses it. Because Jesus' anger is righteous. You know, all anger is not bad. The Bible says, be angry and sin not. And one way that, so that could be translated, in your anger don't sin, or be angry and sin not. But I think in light of the fact that it says sin not, probably that the imperative is meant there. There's a time when anger is legitimate. And so Jesus didn't lose it. He didn't lose his temper. Jesus displayed his righteous temper. Jesus had every right to be upset, and we'll talk about why here in just a minute. But at any rate, he sees this buying and this selling. Now, look at B here. There was a need for buying, selling, and money changing. Jesus getting upset about the buying and the selling and the money changing was not because of the buying, selling, and money changing. We're going to notice in just a minute, it's because of where it was being done. It wasn't that it was being done. The Old Testament explains that there's a need for buying and selling and money changing when you go to the temple. Okay? So, the Old Testament admits to the impossibility of carrying offerings to Jerusalem for those who lived a great distance away. And it actually allowed for those who lived a great distance away to liquidate their tithes and carry the money to Jerusalem, and there in Jerusalem with the money from the sale of their tithes to buy whatever they needed to offer the Lord. Let's look at a passage. Go back to Deuteronomy 14. Deuteronomy 14. So, Deuteronomy 14, beginning in verse 22, gives instructions about bringing your tithe to the place where the Lord will put his name. Initially that was Shiloh. Ultimately that was Jerusalem, especially once the temple is built. All right, so look beginning in verse 24. But if that place is too distant, that is, the place where God puts his name is too distant, you live too far from Jerusalem, and you've been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away, then exchange your tithe for silver, and take the silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. Use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, and other fermented drink, or anything you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. So you see, buying in the place where the Lord puts his name, and by implication selling in the place where the Lord puts his name, that's not a bad thing. That's a legitimate thing. Now, about money changing. Let's comment on money changing. People would come from all over the world. You read about that in Acts 2. Remember how, Acts 2, beginning in verse 9, says that the apostles spoke in the language of Parthians and Medes and Elamites and dwellers in Mesopotamia and Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, the parts of Libya about Cyrene, strangers from Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes and Arabians, etc. That's a lot of different areas. And, even though some of those areas are outside the Roman Empire, like Parthia, most of them are inside the Roman Empire, but it wasn't, exactly like the way it was now. Rome had its set of currency, but it allowed local areas to keep its own sets of currency as well, right? So there is a need, to convert all of this into a common currency. So the type of money that, the temple tax and that sort of thing was paid, in Jerusalem was the Tyrian shekel, the tetradrachma, which a drachma, that's would be the standard wage for a day laborer. So a tetradrachma would be, basically 4 days' pay for a day laborer. But anyway, that was the value of a Tyrian shekel. So there would have to be some conversion, into this common currency, and the money changers were the ones who did that. And then, of course, in the text, you read about those who were selling doves or pigeons. And of course, that was the primary sacrifice animal that was used. And I've got a couple of references there, Leviticus 1:14, Leviticus 5:7, Leviticus 12:8, where you see these doves being used in sacrifice. So, they were being sold. John 2:14, in that earlier incident of Jesus cleansing the temple, it also mentions the selling of sheep and cattle. And of course, those were clean sacrificial animals. So here's the point I want to get. The problem wasn't that the selling and money changing was taking place. That's not the problem. The problem is where it's taken place. You see, typically, the selling of the sacrifices and the money changing, it would take place in bazaars in Jerusalem outside of the temple. But because Jerusalem is just so filled with people, here for the feast, and because the court of the Gentiles is such a spacious place, over 20 acres, the buying and the selling takes place in the court of the Gentiles. And that's what upsets Jesus, because Jesus, after he overturns the tables and drives out the animals and all that sort of stuff, notice what Jesus says. Look at verse 17. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." So Jesus puts two Old Testament passages together. Isaiah 56:7, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations." And then Jeremiah 7:11, "But you've made it a den of robbers." You see, God always wanted the temple to be a place where the Gentiles could come and find Him. Even when Solomon was dedicating the temple there, in 1 Kings chapter 8, I've got the reference here, verses 41 to 43. He talked about Gentiles who hear of the fame of the Lord, and they come to the temple, and they pray to God in the temple, and they find God there in the temple. God wanted the Gentiles to be able to come and to pray and focus on Him. But remember, the only place where the Gentiles can go in the temple at this point in time is the court of the Gentiles. But now there's all this distraction because there's so many Jews who are present who are just, exchanging their money, and they're doing business, and they're buying their doves and all of that. That should have taken place outside of the court of the Gentiles. But they're doing it there, so they're a distraction for the Gentiles. They're a hindrance to the Gentiles seeking God. Well,
Don't you think there was also a situation where some Sadducees and some of the upper power folks were making some money off of this, not only allowing people in there to do it, but probably leasing them spots in there and giving a shake of it?
yeah, there's no doubt. The Sadducees are in control, and if I'm not mistaken, I think that they raise some of these animals, some of the doves and so forth. So no doubt they're making some money, but Jesus never condemns that. Now you say, well, doesn't Jeremiah 7:11, that Jesus quotes, say, "You've made it the den of robbers"? So doesn't that sound like there's some degree of extortion? Well, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe, but maybe not. If you go back and you look at this in Jeremiah 7, so the chapter begins by saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord is here. And the idea seems to be that the Jews felt like they could commit any sin they wanted to commit, and they would be free of God's judgment because they had the temple. And God's never going to destroy His temple. That was a den that protected them, regardless of what sin they want to commit. And so, maybe it's the case that the idea here is we're hindering the Gentiles, but, it's for the cause of the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord is here. It's for the benefit of the temple, and so all is okay. That may be it, but a big key here is they've got the leaves, but they lack the fruit. They've got the leaves, but they lack the fruit. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. It's hypocrisy. And just like David said, I think David's right. They're hindering the Gentiles for the sake of money. And they feel okay. They want to sell, and they feel justified in doing it there, but they're hindering the Gentiles. They're hypocritical. Yeah. All right, look at verse 18. So the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him. See? For they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. So you start messing with the temple. The temple is totally under the control of the Sadducees. They're the chief priests. They're the ones that are in power. And so, Jesus starts messing with all of this, and Jesus is taking his life in his own hands. You remember what Jesus said whenever he cleansed the temple on the earlier occasion? Look at John 2 for just a minute. So, verse 17 of John 2, after Jesus cleanses the temple, we're told his disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." That is, Jesus' zeal for God's house would result in Jesus being consumed. And there's a quote there from Psalm 69. The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" And Jesus answered, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." Now they replied, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple." Now remember, Herod began the renovation process in 19 BC, 19 or 20 BC. And by the way, the renovation process won't be complete until 64 AD. So, you're talking 34 years after Jesus' crucifixion before the renovation of the temple is completed. And then the temple will be destroyed in 70 AD. So, that renovated temple didn't, stand long as such. They said, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he'd spoken of was his body. And so isn't it significant that Jesus links the destruction of his body, his crucifixion, with what he'd done at the temple? Because he'd outraged, the power brokers. And so, look at B under 18:2. The Jewish leaders, the text said in verse 18 that they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. Yeah, and they also feared him. John 11, verses 45 to 53, makes the point they also fear him because the whole crowd is amazed because he's raised Lazarus from the dead. At this point in time, they're still talking about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead because remember, Lazarus died and was buried about 2 miles away in Bethany. And Lazarus is walking around at the Passover too, in the days leading up to the Passover. So he is walking testimony to Jesus' power. And so the Jewish leaders, they meet and they say, "Hey, we got to do something. If we don't do something, the whole world will follow after Jesus, and the Romans will come, and they'll take away our nation, and they'll destroy this temple. We got to do something about Jesus. So then the application or the explanation about the fig tree, which we won't have time for. Any comments? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Which they did. You know, the Romans would come 40 years later and destroy the temple. What's that? Oh, okay. Yes, sir. All right, well, I appreciate everybody's attention. We'll, Lord willing, pick up here next week.